Hi, friends. It's me, Miss Erin. I'm here to read you a book for Martin Luther King Jr. Day. This is called Memphis, Martin, and the Mountaintop, The Sanitation Strike of 1968 by Faye Duncan, illustrated by Gregory Christie. So this is an important part of Dr. King's legacy. This strike and the speeches he then gave as part of the sanitation strike were 5 years after his I Have a Dream speech and several years after his movements in Birmingham. And this is where a lot of violence came to a head and Dr. King was assassinated. So this part of history isn't talked about as much, and this isn't in a normal story type setting. So it is told through poems. I'm not going to read you all of them, but I will read you a select few that I feel like are important. So bear with me. All right. This story was mined from history books and the memories of a Memphis teacher. She was a child. She marched in the Memphis sanitation strike with her mother and father. Men, women, and children contributed to the strike in 1968. Whole families sacrificed their comforts. They suffered for the cause. However, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. paid the highest cost. He gave his life to the struggle for freedom and justice. Memphis, 1968. I remember Memphis. I remember the stinking sanitation strike. Alley cats, rats, and dogs rummaged through piles of trash. Black men marched through Memphis with protest signs raised high. I also marched in 1968 with red ribbons in my hair. You can see her right here. I remember Memphis and legions of noble men. I remember broken glass and the voice of a fallen king. Fire, smoke, and ashes ravaged midnight cityscapes. Black men marched for honor, and I must tell the story. You must tell the story so that no one will forget it. Mud puddles. The conflict started in January, cold and wet with rain. Poor wages for black sanitation workers sparked grumblings of a labor strike. In stormy February, death made the grumbling swell to a loud, blasting rage. I know. I was there as clouds covered the Memphis sky. I had skipped outside to splash and play on the sidewalk in mud puddles. Lorraine! Lorraine! Mama called my name. I could feel it. A punishment was on the way. When Daddy ran up the porch distressed and out of breath, Mama ignored my muddy shoes on her clean kitchen floor. Bad news traveled at lightning speed. There was a tragic accident on a Memphis garbage truck. 2 black men working in the rain never made it home that day for dinner. Their names still live with me. Ethel Cole and Robert Walker dumped garbage with my daddy. Several Memphis garbage trucks were old and unsafe, and the trucks were not maintained. According to my daddy, a packer blade malfunctioning had crushed his friends. Daddy told Mama, "It ain't right. A packer blade. It ain't right to die like that." Mama shook her head, and I saw a new storm rising up. I saw it in their eyes. Marching orders. Memphis sanitation workers shared one common trait. Like my daddy, most of them men were black. They carried rusted garbage barrels as slop dripped down their clothes. White managers called them ugly names too ugly to repeat. The average pay for sanitation workers was $1.70 an hour. Daddy called it starvation pay. Even with a full-time job, he needed government help to buy groceries for our family. Sanitation workers formed a labor union to advocate for their rights. Better pay seemed close at hand. The labor union encouraged better treatment and safety on the job, but the men faced opposition from the Memphis mayor, Henry Loeb. Tall like a giant and stubborn like a mule, Mayor Loeb said no to a pay increase. He did not acknowledge the workers' labor union. The American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, Local 1733. To insult the men even further, Mayor Loeb gave little assistance to the Cole and Walker families, even after they had died. When they could not take the abuse anymore, 1,300 men deserted their garbage routes. They organized a strike on February 12, 1968. In the morning and afternoon, for 65 days, sanitation workers marched 14 blocks through the streets of downtown Memphis. From Claiborne Temple to the steps of City Hall, they squared their shoulders, raised their head, and carried their picket signs. My daddy marched in that number. He marched for better pay. He marched for decent treatment. My daddy marched for me. Winter blues. The strike crippled garbage collection with terrific success. Replacement workers operated 38 garbage trucks, while a whopping 180 trucks stayed parked in the city. Sidewalks turned unsightly by the end of February. Loose papers with crushed cans, empty boxes, food scraps littered the streets. My daddy on the picket line and less money in the house, he rolled pennies to pay our rent. The phone bill went unpaid. 1 week we had no lights. And when classmates visited the candy lady on their way home from school, they bought cookies and pickles and peppermint sticks, and I walked home empty-handed. That year, when I was 9 years old, I learned what the grown folks knew. Trouble visits every life. But as strikers marched through the sun and rain, help came in many forms. A group of Memphis preachers formed Community on the Move for Equality, or COME. C-O-M-E. The organization used church donations to help strikers pay their bills. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, organized boycotts to support the strike. My mama answered their call. In her right hand, she carried the boycott sign. In her left, she held my hand. Together we marched past downtown stores with shiny storefront windows. Pretty shoes made me smile, but Mama's money stayed in her purse, and I wore old shoes all winter. Trouble. Every day, Daddy drove his blue jalopy to jam-packed rallies where strikers sang freedom songs. We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome someday. Music lightened the heavy mood. Daddy clapped his large black hands. He also listened to Memphis preachers who plotted out strike strategies and delivered fiery speeches to encourage the striking men. As winter turned to spring, experienced union leaders flew into Memphis from Washington, D.C. They spoke with the striking workers as advocates and strategists. Still nothing changed. The mayor rallied no to every labor request. And my daddy kept on marching. One night, as I finished homework in the dark, by fading candlelight, Mama pleaded, William, maybe you should quit the strike and go back to work. Daddy hugged Mama tightly. Gladys, he insisted, we gotta hold on till the end. Then I heard him promise, trouble don't always last. Martin. My daddy was a sanitation worker. My mama was a maid. Neither one of them read very well or finished high school. Lifting garbage and cleaning houses was all the work they could find. When Mama's boss paid her wages on Friday, he also put old magazines and newspapers in her carry bags. Mama gave the papers to me. I would read the headlines to both my parents, and we'd follow the strike. I read the headlines that early March when strike negotiations failed. But as Daddy's soles wore thin on his mountain climb, there came a spark of light. Good news filled the air. The headlines encouraged my parents. Dr. King is coming to town. Mama told Miss Brooks, our neighbor, "Girl, I can't believe it." Dr. Martin Luther King practiced nonviolent protests. He was a champion for social change. He had marched for racial equality across Mississippi, Alabama, Washington, D.C. His persistent demand for justice inspired President Johnson to help abolish segregation and sign the Civil Rights Act in 1964. Since Martin had conquered giants in the Valley of Injustice, Reverend Lawson in Memphis believed his powerful friend could help the striking men. And we hoped. Civil rights. I do not plainly comprehend the trouble I saw in 1968. Wisdom came slowly over the mounting years. But when I look back now, I understand. The Memphis struggle was an economic fight. Better wages and pay were a matter of civil rights. Poverty was a civil war. My daddy and his friends were the working poor. Men sought better wages to feed their families and buy decent homes, not the run-down shanties like our home. As public service, sanitation workers deserved better pay to educate their children and give them a future bright with hope. This was the message Dr. King preached when he arrived in Memphis on March 18th. All labor has dignity, he said. Dr. King's voice was loud and stirring. I listened with my parents from a crowded church pew as the famous leader drafted a plan to march in Memphis with the striking men. Dr. King set a date, March 22nd. We need everybody to march that day. Everyone planned to take off work and to take their children. Omen. Yellow daffodils, 16 inches under snow. King canceled his march. A blizzard canceled the march. Beale Street was the site of a riot. Trucks and tanks came in response to the mayor's declaration of a state of emergency. A curfew and National Guard were called out to Memphis. They restored the peace, but the strike seemed to have no end. And the mayor held firm to his anti-labor position. The sight of guns did not send anyone back to work. And from my window, I saw green tanks, and fear locked us in our house. But dreamers don't quit. Dr. King came back to Memphis and told us of his dream. My name is Lorraine, like the Memphis Hotel. Many years have passed, but the building still stands. The Lorraine Motel is a storied shrine. Dr. King shared his last meal and rested there on April 4th, 1968. The leader spent his last hour on the second floor in room 306, where he talked with Ralph Abernathy and Samuel Kiles. They joked and laughed the way good friends do. They spoke of plans for an evening rally with the striking workers. But the laughter did not last for long. Evil showed its ugly head as James Earl Ray hunkered down in the open window of a boarding house. Perched 70 yards from the Lorraine Motel, the escaped convict pointed his rifle at room 306 and waited. He saw his target at 1 minute past 6. Dr. King stepped on the balcony where he greeted his friends in the parking lot. Ray fired a gun and a bullet pierced the dreamer's neck. News of Dr. King's assassination spread quickly. In Washington, D.C., Chicago, and Baltimore, young people expressed their grief with looting and raging fires. Mayor Henry Loeb called for the return of the National Guard to Memphis. But there was no looting, but a fire burned in me as I listened to the radio. Between finger-snapping hits of Aretha Franklin and James Brown, the black disc jockey cried for the loss of Dr. King. I cried too and wrote in my school notebook, "The king is dead. Not long ago there lived a king. He did not sleep in a castle. He did not wear a crown. He did not rule a royal court or ride in chariots. The king marched in the streets. He lived to help the poor. He lived for peace and love. Hate killed the king. The king is dead. What will the people do? His wife, Coretta Scott King, flew to Memphis, committed to a plan. Dr. King had pledged to support the sanitation strike with a non-violent march, and despite her broken heart, Mrs. King and members of her group helped to keep her husband's pledge on April 8, 1968. The memorial march served as a tribute to honor Dr. King's life. It also reminded the mayor that workers would continue to strike until justice was received. In a wave of 40,000 people, I marched that day between my mama and daddy. Those who marched with us were ministers, labor leaders, political figures, entertainers, everyday people from Memphis and around the nation. Nobody spoke a word. We raised our signs. Honor King. End racism. Union justice now. Mrs. King marched from Memphis. Behind a veil of mourning, she buried her love in Georgia. The sanitation strike ended on April 16, 1968. Mayor Loeb never bargained with the workers. President Lyndon B. Johnson sent James Reynolds, a top U.S. labor official, to negotiate the settlement. Reynolds brokered an agreement between the sanitation workers and the Memphis City Council. In the final deal, the city recognized the Memphis Workers' Labor Union. The men received a pay increase of just 15 cents an hour, and they were promised promotions based on merit, not race. I remember that day thinking of the stinking strike coming to an end. It was a Tuesday after Easter. Daddy marched proudly into the house and smiled at Mama and me. He picked me up, kissed my face, and cried on Mama's neck. Mama squeezed us tightly as tears filled her eyes. So much was won. So much was lost. Freedom is never free. The Mountaintop. Dream big. Walk tall. Be strong. March on. Don't quit. Never stop. Climb up. The Mountaintop. So, I hope you enjoyed this powerful story. It is one that speaks to my heart. It is something that I hope we all remember every day of how hard it is to fight for what is right. And I just want you to know that I love you and I like you, and I'll see you next time.